Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from me as well. I am Guilherme Martinez Roura from the International Telecommunication Union, and I would like to welcome you all for joining today's AI for Good webinar on biorobotics for emulating and studying animal locomotion, organized by the ITU. This session is part of the AI for Good robotics programming track, exploring how AI-powered robots are helping to unlock our human potential and advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have a distinguished set of panelists today, but as always, we are counting on you, the participants, to help create a very interactive session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator today. His name is Richard Bonfrey, and he's the Professor of Comparative Biomechanics at the Royal Veterinary College, London. Richard, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited here, and especially so to talk on such an interesting and stimulating topic with such a fantastic panel. I'm really looking forward to their presentations and the discussion that follows. I will introduce those at the end of a few slides, which are my thoughts on this topic. So if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, I will share my screen and run through that and then introduce the great lineup we've got coming up any second. Okay, so my name's Richard Bonfrey. I work at the Royal Veterinary College. Its principal business is being a vet school. However, there's more people here working on fundamental bioscience, and it actually has quite a rich track history of converting that into bio-inspired robotics. Today, it's been tagged by the ITU as addressing number 15 on the sustainability goals of the UN. However, I think it touches on many more topics than that, including the ones that I've listed at the bottom. And as the talk goes on, or the talks go on, you might think about how these features that we're dealing with and the issues that we're talking about could have a positive impact in the various bits that we're seeing down there in the tab at the bottom. Okay. Some of the issues have been covered in the biological literature already, and I just want to draw your attention to a special edition in the Royal Society talking about stability and maneuverability in animal movements. And really it's about how biology can inform robotics, but also a little bit about the two-way street of how the robotics and physical models can inform fundamental biological investigations. And that was written or edited together with some of the panelists we have here today, and also Monica Daly. And then also a recent article in the Journal of Experimental Biology, which deals mostly with the aviation side of things, which is the lessons from natural flight for aviation. And it picks up on a few of the aspects of fundamental bioscience investigations which make them particularly informative for engineered design rather than for biological investigation per se. Now you can think of animal locomotion in terms of a control loop, and this is equally true for terrestrial locomotion or swimming as it is for flight. But the way I like to think of it is an engineer's control loop like this. And if we look at the top here, we have wings, and they're a certain shape, and they're activated by muscles, and that gives you different kind of kinematics. And the wings may change shape during that time, whether actively or passively. And as they do so, they change the aerodynamic forces that are produced, which changes the three-dimensional flight trajectory through space. And as animals are flying or walking or running or swimming, they get a rich input of sensory information, which has to be processed by the controller. And that tells the muscles then how to activate possibly slightly differently, which changes the kinematics, and round we go along this control loop once again. And then abstracting concepts from that, you can put them onto things which don't resemble the animals very much at all, but they potentially have useful capabilities which have been gleaned from that original observation. So the messages and possibly the themes we're going to talk about today are that the mechanism I just described in that control loop, they're all interactive and they're co-evolved. If you change one, you'll change the others. In particular, for this one, you might say if you change the wing shape, then that's going to change the sensing information which comes into the controller. It's also going to change the dynamics of the muscles which are required to drive those wings, and so on and so forth. So essentially, it's all interlinked, and you have to take a holistic view of the whole process. We need to get a good understanding of the way that biological models work, and that has to be based on observational science. You can certainly be testing hypotheses as you go along, but having a fundamental look to see what's going on is definitely the first step on the way to these biological investigations. You might want to disentangle which aspects of the locomotion patterns are passive and which are active. And that can be in terms of processing, or it can be in terms of the physiology of muscular control. And then it's never a good idea to blindly mimic an animal. So you might find that one is particularly skilled in a certain aspect of their locomotion, but it's doing a lot of other things as well. So it might have, for example, a reproductive system or a digestive system, which are not at all relevant to the robot that you want to build. So it's an abstraction of the concepts rather than blind mimicry. So we sometimes do see from nature performance advantages, and that can be in terms of robustness and stability, topics which are definitely going to come up later in this session. It might be about the economy of travel. It might be things about the material properties and the processing and so on. But biological observation does not give a ready-made faultless design for any particular challenge that you may want to address. Because you have to remember Dobbs-Ampsey's quote of 1973, which is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So I'm going to give you some examples from birds, some examples from insects, and how they've been implemented into robotics concepts in my own lab. And we have a lot of fun with it. Here is a 360 camera and you're riding on the back of a golden eagle around the lochs of Scotland. And this was a very blustery day, and the bird didn't flap its wings once. What you just saw was a tuck maneuver, which is a way of dealing with the turbulence. And so it manages to keep its head very still. It manages to track objects on the ground, and it manages to fly with very, very little muscular effort, all told. And so there's clearly some performance concepts there that we would quite like to assess and potentially emulate. And to do that, we can bring it into the lab. And here we have a tawny eagle this time, flying over a big vertical jet of air. And what I want you to concentrate on is that for the tawny eagle and for the barn owl that's coming up in a moment, the head and the body remain very stable, traveling on a smooth trajectory, yet the wings pop up. And the reason that they do that is because they're acting as a suspension system to dissociate the masses in the wings with the masses in the body. And just like your seat stays more stable in your car while the tires go up and down, that's much as the same as how birds are negotiating turbulence. We can also look at the drag produced by these animals, and again with clear implications for aviation. Here we're flying birds of prey through some neutrally buoyant bubbles. They're about 1/5 of a millimeter in size and filled with enough helium so that they remain suspended at a certain altitude. And as the birds glide through, you can see that they're swirling up the air, and we can do aerodynamic assessment of that to determine how birds are managing to, in this case, minimize the viscous effect of drag. To quantify that, we can also track each of those particles. So here we're tracking 20,000 bubbles simultaneously with a company in Germany called LaVision. And the bubbles that are blue are accelerating downwards very fast, and the bubbles that are red are actually accelerating upwards, which is an economic loss, but it's the same wingtip vortex that you would see behind aircraft of all sizes. Now moving on to insects. We can do both structural modeling and we can do computational modeling. And here what you're seeing is a very high fidelity model of a dragonfly's wing. And we're subjecting it to a flow as though it's gliding. And you can see that the wing is flexing as it does so. And this is part of the sensory information which is available to dragonflies for the flight controller that is fundamentally different and a completely different architecture from the way that we currently design aircraft. If you think about aircraft, they have a complex processor with redundancy, and they get very hot and they're not particularly efficient. Whereas insects manage to fly in a very robust way with a brain the size of a pinhead on the order of tens of thousands of neurons, which is very minimal processing power. And one of the keys to this is to measure as little as possible, as infrequently as possible, and to do both distributed sensing and distributed processing. So by monitoring the strain patterns on this wing and understanding the sensors which encode those patterns, we can start to look at the flight controller and look at different neural architectures which can control complex motions in very unpredictable environments with capacity far in excess of what we can currently manage with engineering solutions. We can also look at pest species which will have some societal benefits. In particular, I'm focusing on mosquitoes here. This one's Culex, but of course we've worked on malaria mosquitoes and dengue mosquitoes as well. And again, by tracking their wings, we can understand the aerodynamic flows that go on around these small animals, and also how they manage to have capabilities which we would like to emulate. In this case, how they manage to avoid surfaces without being able to see them. So even in the pitch black, they will avoid surfaces at light levels below that at which their eyes are functioning. We can also use the computational fluid dynamics analysis to understand their aeroacoustic communication in the swarms. So in the center of this, there's a female mosquito, and the spheres that you see there are different sound levels, which may or may not be detectable by the males that are forming the swarm. And that can inform acoustic lures for trapping and surveillance, or potentially disruption of mosquito swarm and mating behavior. If we look at the flows at different altitudes, we'll see that they're slightly different. And this is the same sort of concept as when a helicopter gets close to the ground and starts to incur recirculation. How do we apply that to robotics? Well, we can create small quadcopters which look nothing like mosquitoes, but are using, in this case, differential pressure sensors, which I've circled in, or I've squared, if you like, in purple, running into convolutional neural networks, which can predict the distance and bearing to an obstacle which is approaching. And we can combine that with other sensory modalities, such as vision or acoustic sensors, to get more than the sum of its parts, and therefore a future where we have quadcopters and other aircraft which are more sensitive to obstacle detection and therefore have improved safety. This long exposure shot shows one such quadcopter. It comes in from the left, it descends, it realizes there's an obstacle there, it goes up and it descends again, and again you can see it knows that there's an obstacle there as the red lights come on, so it descends once more. On quadcopters, we know it works. We think it works on midges and mosquitoes, but what about full-scale helicopters, crewed helicopters? Well, this is very much a work in progress, but by attaching a mosquito-inspired sense and avoid device, we're currently showing that helicopters can improve their safety by detecting the ground plane's And this is also particularly applicable to potential modern air taxis, such as the Airbus concept in the bottom right. We can increase turbulence robustness as well. Here is the hinged wing concept on the left, which is based on the bird flight I showed you earlier, compared with a fixed wing on the right-hand side, which is how we currently design aircraft. And you'll see that the one on the right gets perturbed vastly more than the hinge wing concept, which would make your ride in a passenger airline considerably more comfortable. Now, I mentioned earlier, we've got an absolutely outstanding lineup of speakers for you today. First up, we're going to have Andy Bwiner. Andy's served as for 20 years, I think, as editor of the Journal of Experimental Biology, including 16 years as editor-in-chief. He's going to be talking to you about legged terrestrial locomotion and also flight control through clustered environments, and the principles of guiding movement so that it's both maneuverable and robust. He'll also talk a little about his experiences working with engineers, despite coming from a biological background, and how transparency is important in that lines of communication. He also has written some excellent books, which I would point you to. Animal Locomotion and How Life Works are both excellent ways into this field. We will then move on to Amy Wisser. Amy moved her lab to Princeton last year from Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She has the US Air Force Office of Scientific Research Young Investigator Award and an NSF Career Award to her name. And she now directs the Bio-Inspired Adaptive Morphology Lab, working on insects, flying fish, birds, and indeed bio-inspired robots. We then move on to Auke Eisbeert, who's head of the Biorobotics Lab at EPFL, Lausanne. He's an IEEE fellow and editor at Science and Soft Robotics, and also other journals as well. He'll be talking to you about central pattern generators, reflexes, descending modulation, how musculoskeletal systems can be understood via robotics, and indeed vice versa. And finally, we'll have Robert Full. Bob is a AAAS fellow and has worked on a very wide range of animals, from early fish to humans and everything in between. Bob is the editor-in-chief of the IOP Bioinspiration and Biomimetics Journal, which can be a bit of a goldmine for work in this field. And he's going to be talking about physical models for testing biological hypotheses, also how intelligence can be embodied into functional morphology, and how that can be used to simplify control. So without further ado, I will unshare and pass you over to Andy to begin his talk.
Thank you, Richard. I'll get started here. Let me share my screen and we'll get going. So greetings, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to kick off this webinar about biorobotics for emulating and studying animal locomotion. As Richard noted, I'm a biologist who studies the neuromechanics and comparative biomechanics of animal locomotion. I'm not an engineer or roboticist, but I have had two significant research collaborations with bioengineers. The first was with the Boston Dynamics team that developed Big Dog versions 1 through 3, funded through a DARPA biodynamics program. And then second set of collaborations with primarily people at MIT, work funded through the ONR in the US for developing robust flight control programs for flying UAVs through cluttered environments. So two main points out of these collaborations are, one is that there really is the opportunity for a collaborative synergy between biology and engineering and robotics, which can provide inspiration for the design of robust terrestrial and aerial robots that can navigate real-world environments that will benefit surveillance, rescue, environmental sensing, and other outcomes. These are outcomes that I think both Bob and certainly the other contributors will speak to. But it also stimulates.
Sorry, Andy, just to quickly interrupt, would you mind to go into the presentation mode, because we can still see all of the slides.
Thank you very much. Okay, yeah.
Pleasure.
There we go. One more button I had to click. So it also provides an important opportunity for stimulating novel animal locomotion experiments on the side of biology. And these engineering biology collaborations are really helpful for identifying key principles guiding movement, which are often not easily known. So this is our collaboration with Dynamics. Play this a little bit. This is Big Dog 2, but you can see the counter-dynamic robot. I'm going to get rid of the camera. So it makes a lot of noise, but it was stable and moving over a rock field. And this experiment was, and test on the robot was stimulated based on experiments we did describing the ability of goats to run over a rockway and their ability to stabilize their feet on both uneven surfaces of rocks and rocks that move. And this came out of studying the design of their hooves. The cloven hoof is an artiodactyl. They're able to conform automatically, so passive control of conformation of rock surfaces gave them increased stability. And then with the ultimate Big Dog 3 here showing it moving over uneven terrain down the slope of a snowy slope, and then also being able to maintain support on a icy, slippery surface. So a lot of the control of this Big Dog 3 really was both developing control algorithms, but also understanding the underlying biomechanics of legged locomotion for controlling energy state of the center of mass. Also stimulated us to do experiments by building a climbing wall for goats that included force plates in it. And I'm going to go back here and pause this once we don't get the sound. And we were able to look at goats that climb up a climbing wall with 2 force plates embedded that allowed us to study how the forelimbs operate as a targeting a foot position and follow the leader, where the forelimbs don't make any direct any force on the second force plate on the slope, but provide a targeting location for the hind limbs. One reason the forelimbs don't generate force is it would otherwise pitch the animal away from the slope and it would fall. So the hind limbs then provide the propulsion for climbing by increasing the joint work through increased range of motion. And these are experiments we simply would not have thought to do if we hadn't been collaborating with engineers on the Biorobotics project with Big Dog. So the main insights from our collaboration with Boston Dynamics was that quadrupedal robots really require for stability a knee forward, elbow back configuration. This is Big Dog 1, which had the knees pointing backwards as the elbows do, and it really was not, sorry about that, was not stable and couldn't negotiate over that rock wall. So a simple matter of orienting the knees forward and the elbows back, as David Lee's work, who was a postdoc on the project, showed, biases the ground reaction forces closer to the animal center of mass and reduces the pitch moments. And we did subsequent experiments with goats and dogs running over force platforms to quantify pitch moments relative to the center of mass and show that they were minimized during trotting and increase in galloping, but they were really able to minimize those pitch moments by moving the center of ground reaction force and the ground reaction force center of pressure relative to the animal center of mass. We also found that goats and dogs have energy dissipating foot design. So over here, we modeled the joint mechanics of the elbow, wrist, and metatarsal phalangeal joints and metacarpophalangeal joints in the knee and the ankle in the hind limbs, and where the proximal joints were able to do actuator work and produce energy for moving the animal to actuate and increase its center of mass energy state. The distal joints actually dissipate energy. So it's really the design of muscle tendon units that act as dissipative elements, sort of stabilizing the animal. And this was probably central to the ability of the goats to be able to move over uneven rocky terrain. However, this was not a design element that Boston Dynamics was willing to incorporate into their Big Dog robot because it's a cost of energy, and loss of energy in a actuated fluid driven system was something that they wanted to avoid. So that was a design concept that from the biology side, they weren't willing to incorporate. On the side of flight, we did experiments to try to develop better control algorithms for how, in this case, pigeons, we studied flying through an artificial vertical field of poles, an obstacle field, which shows the down below, which they fly between perches. And we had active markers that allowed us to measure body and head orientations through this vertical field of poles. This allowed us to develop a very simple proportional derivative steering controller that steered the pigeons towards the widest gap relative to their heading direction. That's shown down here. And they basically found that they only really need to pay attention to the first 1.5 meters in front of them, because that's the point at which they begin to actually show signs of maneuvering to change their heading direction, and within a plus or minus 30 degrees of their current heading. And this proportional derivative controller provided very robust control for flight control through the obstacle field. We also did experiments in which we've tested the ability of pigeons to navigate through vertical pole spacings as narrow as only allowing for a centimeter clearance on either shoulder. And we found that they had very robust strategies for navigating through very tight spaces relative to wider spaces. And this stimulated the design of a autonomous aircraft that was run by the MIT group.
We have built an autonomous aircraft.
You can see that in this video, the aircraft has to roll and pitch its wings,
motion capture
but it only goes through a set of two poles that simply control the flight through that narrow space.
We have built an autonomous aircraft.
Our flight controller was able to, in these pigeon flights through the vertical trajectory of randomized poles, was able to match 70% of the obstacle flights. This widest gap steering model matched previous studies that show that both birds and bees use balancing left-right optic flow cues to guide their flight paths. It's a relatively simple and fast control model to implement, so it provides a very robust pattern for controlling UAVs in forward flight. And then we also did independent free simulations in which we were able to get 90% of those simulations to fly through randomized pole distributions without any failure due to collisions. So the main insights that came from our collaboration on controlling UAVs through cluttered flight is that birds, in this case pigeons, are highly maneuverable. A simple widest gap navigational model captures large majority of the flight trials through the cluttered forest, which was these vertical obstacle poles. It greatly exceeds the navigational maneuvering ability of the UAVs, as you saw in the video of the one UAV navigating through two poles of a given spacing. And as you can see from the videos of the pigeons, wing morphing, the ability of the birds to change the shape of the wing in real time, as well as a superb kinesthetic sense of their body and wing position, underlies the bird's ability to robustly navigate through cluttered environments. So to finish up, my main take-home points for this webinar are that, no surprise, animals are far more agile, maneuverable, robust, and adept at locomotion under challenging conditions compared with biorobots. And this minimizes both their fall and collision risk. Animals successfully integrate visual, in the case of birds, that's a key sensory cue, but also proprioceptive feedback to guide their movements. And this is something that Richard covered in his introduction. And I would like just to emphasize that most biorobots are teleoperated. They're not really autonomous in terms of navigation. So developing true autonomous robots that can navigate natural environments is really a great opportunity for artificial intelligence to help develop guidance for biorobotic movements and, importantly as well, decision-making. And so in that context, they have the opportunity to potential for very good services in terms of surveillance, rescue, environmental sensing, et cetera, in natural environments. And through my collaboration with Boston Dynamics, I used to point out the need for greater transparency between a commercial biorobotics company that protected its intellectual property. There was a lot of information from the biology to the engineers for improving the design of the big dog robot, but very little came back to us as biologists to understand what the central elements of their design was for control and operation of the robot. So with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Amy to continue. So I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Andy. That's fantastic. I've got a ton of questions myself. I imagine they're coming in over the neural network as well. But we have to be good and wait for them all for the end. I'll contain myself as well. Okay, so if you're ready to go, Amy, we very much look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Sure. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for including me in this panel. I look forward to sharing with you my passion about bio-inspired locomotion across scales and mediums. I'm an engineer by training, so I'm looking forward to kind of share my perspective on how engineers contribute to the field of bio-inspired robotics and how these collaboration actually are really true collaborations between biologists and engineers really are the way to advance this field forward. So before I want to start, I want to acknowledge my students who are part of my lab. These are the people who actually make this work happen, and also our funding agency that provide us with the support needed to be able to carry out some of this work. So as Richard mentioned, and I think this is a theme that's going to keep coming up, biology engineering is a two-way street. From the video I just showed you, it's clear how biology has a lot to teach us as engineers, so how we can learn from these solutions to design better engineering systems. But this is half of the picture. As engineers, we can actually contribute a lot to the field in terms of applying engineering models and experiments and creating controlled environments. As a lot of the biologists will tell you, animals don't usually do what they want them to do when you want them to do it. So as engineers, we can design controlled experiments and create well-behaved physical models that allows us to actually answer key questions about biology. And as most of the projects you probably see today, this is a highly iterative process where one time you might start saying, I really want to learn how to fly like a bird. But then the more you do experiments, the more you actually start thinking about and asking questions about bird flight, and you keep going back and forth. So you can walk these two-way street in many fields, materials, controls, collective behavior, different areas. My lab really walks it in terms of locomotion and movement strategies. So for today, I want to spend some time telling you about an example of the bio-inspired engineering way of the street, or how we can learn from birds to design better UAVs, for example. And then the other half of the talk, showing you an example of engineering-informed biology using the flying fish as the case study organism. So let's get to it. Now, when you do the bio-inspired engineering, basically you start by a societal need or a problem in our engineering world, and then you find the possible, a viable biological solution, and then you start, through learning and through adapting and building and testing and modeling, you finally come to an engineering implementation, again, that doesn't mimic the biology necessarily, but that captures the important physics. So this is a market study that came out, I think, in 2016 or 2017, showing growth in the UAV market from 2014 all the way to 2026. In all sectors, so agriculture, defense, energy, media, and entertainment. And I'm sure if we look at more recent studies, we can find other sectors being introduced to this. In order for a UAV or an uncrewed aerial vehicle to be able to perform all these missions for all these applications, they need to be agile. But for some aerial vehicles, if you push them beyond their flight envelope, this is what happens. So what you see here is a drone. It goes to really high angle of attack with this pitch up maneuver. And what you see here is stall or loss in lift. In contrast, here's an eagle doing landing or a perch. And you're just seeing really controlled descent, really interesting kinematics, and just, again, a lot for the drones, to be desired. So there's a lot to be looking at. There's a lot of things we can look at here. The sensory, the big, large wing kinematics. My labs just look at feathers and their role in distributed flow control. So I also want to point out something here that's important. When we look at bird wings, unlike aircraft wings, I think what we see here is a multifunctional and an adaptive structure. It creates many functions and is able to respond to changes in the airflow, both passively and actively. And I think Richard touched on this. So my group just focuses on a group of feather called the covert's feather, and that's what I want to talk about for the next few slides. So birds have many feather systems, and one of those is called the coverts. And research have shown that the coverts they're on the top and bottom side of the bird wing, and research have shown them, flight observations have shown them to be deployed during like a gust or during a landing and perching maneuver. And when you see this as an engineer, like the big question I have, can we use something similar to the coverts to enhance the performance of UAVs, especially at high angles of attack or extreme maneuvers? So We designed a very simple system. It does not look like feathers. It actually look at like just as flaps. And we distributed it all around the airfoil surface. These are purely passive, meaning the oscillations that you see are purely in response to the aerodynamic loads. There is no sensing, there is no actuators. This is completely passive. And what we do is we put this in the wind tunnel, and we are able to measure forces and torques. We're able to use lasers and cameras to actually see how the air flows around the wing. So here's an example of air flowing around the wing at this high angle of attack. And what you see here is the air is like separated and turbulent. And if you would measure the lift here, you would see a significant lift drop, which would result in the catastrophic failure you saw earlier. So what we did, we actually, when we combined a lot of these flaps, I'm going to show you just a hint of the result. If you look at just the airfoil without any flaps, you get the same picture I showed you, and this significant drop in lift is what you saw earlier in the video. Now, we create a system with 5 of these flaps that are passively deploying back and forth, and what you see is actually you have mitigated stall. There is no significant drop in lift. And when you look at the flow field here in this video, what you'll see is the air is actually a lot closer to the surface of the airfoil. So this shear layer is a lot closer to the surface of the airfoil. And we're looking at enhancing a lift of like 50%. So that's payload capability that is really impressive for UAVs. But then this was all passive. We can actually, because we understand how this principle works, we can actually now implement it actively. So we do a control system. We're able to put this in front of a wind wall. Here's a wing that has no tail. And just by having an upper surface and a lower surface covert inspired flap, it's able to be stabilized in yaw. And then we can take this actually to the field. And here's an airborne kite. That's an inflatable kite with these bio-inspired flaps, and it's able to fly and regulate its yaw oscillation. And here it's doing something called a figure 8 maneuver that is used for energy harvesting, wind energy harvesting, by being connected to a motor and a winch. So this shows that carefully abstracted design and carefully abstracted biological principles can actually help us design better systems for flight systems in general, both passive and active. Now, if we jump to the other side of the street, I want to show you this engineering-informed biology looking at the flying fish. This is a collaborative project with Professor Brooke Fleming at NGIT. And in this case, we start with a biological question about the flying fish in this case. And then we try to design a physical model that can capture the important, that's biologically relevant. And then we use that to form new hypotheses and ask questions about the locomotion of the flying fish. So if you haven't met them before, meet the flying fish. They are awesome fish. There's about, I think, 27 species. And what's really interesting about them is that their ability to be both efficient in swimming under the water and gliding above the water surface. And if you, and this behavior would happen if there's a big prey that is attacking the fish from below. And if you kind of break this locomotion cycle, first you start, it's a fish, so they swim. And then when there is a threat, they leap out of the water and they deploy their wings. Sometimes they need to actually taxi on the surface of the water using their caudal fin or their tail until they get enough speed. They're able to take off. If the threat didn't go away, they keep doing this, and they're actually able to do this for up to 0.5 kilometer. This is gliding. It's not a powered flight, which is really interesting from an energetic standpoint. And then when the threat is over, they just go back in the water and keep going. These are the main features that I want to just draw your attention to: the pectoral fins, the pelvic fin, the caudal fin. And for the flying fish, we just asked 2 questions. The first one is, what is the deal with the pelvic fin? Why do some species so that's a biological question. Why do some species have pelvic fins while the other don't? Or maybe a better question is, how do the species that have pelvic fin use them compared to the one that do not have them? The other question we asked is, so if you look at the flying fish, they have a really interesting caudal fin. It's asymmetric, and very old research, but awesome research showed that during taxiing, only the lower lobe is actually submerged. And the big working hypothesis is that during taxiing, the fish only submerge this, and the question is, the goal of taxiing is to be able to get out of the water as quickly as possible. So the question is, is there any thrust benefit of just submerging the lower lobe? To answer both of these questions, it was really hard. As you can imagine, it's really hard to capture these flying fish, to keep them in the lab. They need like meters and meters. So one of the best ways to study them is to use a robotic model organism or a physical model of the fish. So here is a video showing the robot we designed. It's modular, it has simple design, it does not look like a fish at all, but it captures the right movement, the right kinematics, the right dynamics, and the right physics. And it's modular. So here is it just on a stand, just to show you the swimming motion. Then we added pectoral fins, and this allows us to also look at flight. So then the robot would have the caudal fin to allow us to study some of the hypotheses about the taxiing, and the pectoral and pelvic fins that allow us to study the first question. So real quick, for the first question, we did wind tunnel testing for configuration with and without pelvic fins, and we're able to move it across the robot. For the second question, we're taxiing, we actually designed the robot, put it in the water channel, vary the submersion depth of the fin. And for the first question, we found what is the benefit of the pelvic fin, and we actually found that it's a trade-off between efficiency and stability. And then we found that if you want to, like, the right location of this trade-off is to put the pelvic fin somewhere in the rear of the fish and at some at intermediate pitch angles. And actually, by looking at actual footage of flying fish through actually crowdsourcing, we found that for most of the species we were able to get footage of, the pelvic fins are located in a place that suggests that trade-off. It's not really favoring efficiency or stability, but between both. For the second question, we found that in the experiments that I showed you, that actually there is no thrust benefit to just submerge the lower lobe. So maybe there's other reasons why the fish is only submerged in the lower lobe, or because of how old these observation is, that maybe it is not just submerged in the lower lobe and the whole caudal fin is submerged during taxiing. So to conclude, I just want to highlight that this kind of research on bio-inspired robotics and all for the other panelists and myself, it is highly interdisciplinary. It would not be possible without all these collaborations. And it is challenging because it requires for us to think about different physics. And it's a large parameter space. There's a lot of things to consider, and that's where AI can be of huge benefit to reduce such a parameter space. And with that, I would like to thank you and to just play a few videos here of other systems that we look in the lab. I look forward to the discussions and questions later. And with that, I would like to hand it back to Richard and to Auka. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. It's very thought-provoking. I like the way you went from eagles that catch fish to fish as well, and everything in between, and stall control and all that sort of stuff. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that as well. But before we do, we're going across to Auka first. Are you ready, Auka?
Yeah, all good. I hope you hear me well.
Take it away.
Yeah, let's start. All right, hello everyone. Let me start this. Okay, sorry. All right, so welcome everyone. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this. And indeed, I'd like to continue a bit the discussion of how robots can be used to study animal locomotion, and also how neuromechanical simulations can be used, like following very nicely the example of Amy and Andy and Richard. So I'm a roboticist and a computational neuroscientist, and I'm really fascinated by animal locomotion. So if you look at this dog running, its nervous system is solving a super complex control problem because it's high dimensional. It has to use more or less 300 muscles. It's highly nonlinear. The relationship between the muscles and the forward speed is very complicated, and it's clearly unstable. So you have to do it properly to avoid falling. So it's really impressive and beautiful how the nervous system can solve this so well. And what I showed there was just steady state. What's even more impressive I think, are these agility competitions, where you see dogs getting points for how well they cross a parkour. And here you see the beauty of modulating the gaits extensively with multiple sensory modalities from vision, vestibular system, proprioception. And I'm really impressed by how good animals are doing this. And I think that the robotics perspective can help to decode a bit the main ingredients and how they interact to generate this beautiful locomotion. And at the first approximation, I think there are 4 main ingredients. The first one is the clever mechanics, the musculoskeletal system, which is very well designed to do locomotion. Then there is the spinal cord with both, obviously, multiple reflex loops that are super important, and this very interesting concept of central pattern generators. These are networks of neural circuits that can oscillate by themselves, and they kind of feed forward controller to provide rhythmic patterns as necessary for locomotion. And then obviously you have higher levels of the brain that will modulate all this with the descending pathways. But what's interesting is there's a fairly finite number of these pathways, and there are not that many. So it's a bit like a puppet on string, where with a limited set of strings, the higher part of the brain can modulate complex locomotion. And I find this very fascinating. So in my lab, we like to use models and robots to investigate how these work together. And especially we focus a lot on the spinal cord circuits, how the feedback and the feed-forward components of the spinal cord work. And we have the hypothesis that during evolution, the respective role of these components have changed, with lower vertebrates like lamprey and salamander being more CPG driven by the feed-forward central pattern generators. And the more you go to terrestrial mammals, which have more unstable locomotion, the more you need to have multiple reflex loops and more descending modulation to do visually guided feed placement. But to test this, we need models, so models of these circuits. And I think robots have a key role to play to close the loop with the real environment. And here, one of my favorite animals that I've been studying for quite some time is the salamander, which is a very interesting animal. It's a very old animal. And here as an amphibian, we made a robot that can replicate it. And what was interesting is that we could show how the beauty of the central pattern generators, how they can beautifully control locomotion under the control of, in this case, just 2 descending drives, representing stimulus from high part of the brain sent to the spinal cord. In our case, we do it with a remote control. But what we could demonstrate is that with 2 signals, you can nicely control the speed, the heading, and even the type of gait by going into swimming mode, which we do the high drive mode is swimming, and low drive mode is walking. So I think this is a nice invention of nature, is to have this multi-layered control and make sure that the spinal cord is in charge of this low-level pattern generation that you see here in the salamander. Nowadays, we look a lot on sensory feedback, how sensory feedback plays an important role as well. And we went back to just anguilliform swimming. So as you see in lamprey or eels. And here what's interesting, for instance, in the eel is a very robust animal, in the sense that if you do a transection of the spinal cord of the eel, it can keep swimming and you almost see no difference compared to the intact animal. So it's very robust in terms of swimming skills. And it looks like, therefore, there must be some kind of local mechanism below the transections to be able to keep the oscillators active and to keep them synchronized with the rest of the body. And it must be sensory driven, since the direct signals are not arriving anymore below the lesions. So here with colleagues, we wanted to see how this works. And again, using simple models of the circuitry, the oscillators, the coupling, the feedback, and the robot, we could study how possibly this works in the real animal. So what we did is, for instance, design a swimming robot with a very primitive skin, where we have little load cells behind each little black plate. And with that, we can mimic a bit how the skin can sense force between left and right on every segment. And we can provide that to our models of the spinal cord. And what's interesting here, like also mentioned by Amy, we can do things that are very hard to do on the real animal. So on the real animal, we know the circuit is complete. It has feedback, it has coupling, it has oscillators. But here we can see systematically what's the role of each of these components. And maybe the most interesting result of the paper was when we removed all direct couplings, like an extreme case of the eel experiment. There's no communication directly between the oscillators. And we wanted to see if the local feedback could compensate for these missing connections. So here is what happens. So on the left, you see a video where we start with random initial conditions. There's no coupling and no feedback. So obviously, there's no way of synchronizing all these oscillators, and there's no way of getting good swimming. You kind of get a bit of wriggling, but not forward locomotion. But what's interesting, if you now include the feedback and still don't have any coupling, the feedback, even if it's very local, leads to a global emergence of the traveling wave. And it synchronizes beautifully. And not only that, it also synchronizes at the right phase lag to do very good forward swimming. So that's interesting because it means that in principle, sensory feedback could synchronize all these decoupled oscillators. And it's probably what happens in the eel, where the feedback compensates for missing couplings. So we also did this on the real robot. It takes a bit more time to reach steady state. So every oscillator doesn't know what the neighbors are doing. But by just measuring the local force on of the water on the left and right of the skin, that local signal becomes a nice global emergent phenomena for swimming. So sensory feedback also does its job on the real robot. So to summarize, what's interesting here, I think, is the fact that CPG circuits have this beautiful feed-forward component and can modulate locomotion extensively. But on top of that, the feedback plays a lot of important role, not only to handle perturbation, which is obviously important, but even can contribute to synchronizing oscillators or even generate rhythm, something I didn't have time to cover. So therefore, in animals, there's this beautiful flexibility and self-organized locomotion where many things we see are like emergent properties of multiple mechanisms contributing together. And in terms of robotics, I think this is a very nice source of inspiration for a very fault-tolerant distributed control. You can make systems that are really robust and keep swimming despite having missing connections or missing sensors. Now, very rapidly, in the last 2 minutes, another project where we wanted to use robots to explore locomotion. This was a nice collaboration with John Nakatura and John Hutchinson, where we wanted to study the past and use a robot to study the Biorobotics, which is an early tetrapod. It's in between amphibians and reptiles. And what's interesting, it's an extinct animal, it doesn't exist anymore, but we have a very well preserved fossil of that animal and also preserved footprints of the same species. So it's a kind of a unique way of trying to match a morphology to a foot track and see what was the most likely gait that that animal had been used. And here again, a robotics approach can be useful to do scientific work because we can replicate more or less the morphology of the animal. And then we can use inverse kinematic controllers to systematically explore the space of possible gait that this animal could have been used. And in the paper, we define different important criteria like the body lift, how high was the body, how much did the animal use the spine, how much does it use the first degree of freedom versus the second one in the chain of the limbs. And basically, we would explore all possible gaits that this animal could have been using. And what's interesting, we could also compare that to modern animals. And what we found out is, first of all, that in principle, the animal could have used many, many gaits. So all the little points here are possible gaits that the animal could have used. But then if you quantify how likely they are according to some matrix, like how much energy does a gait use, how well balanced is it, how accurate is it to walk in the footprints, we kind of zoomed in into the most likely gait and found that the most likely gait is very similar, we believe, to the caiman, which is a quite modern reptile.
Thank you, Elke. It's really interesting how you have to like advance as far as possible to look back as far as possible. I'm sure there's an analogy with space telescopes or something like that. But yeah, that was great. Okay, right, and now to our final speaker of the afternoon before we get into questions and discussion, and that's Bob Full. Are you ready, Bob?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, take it away. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Does it look okay?
Yep.
Thank you for this opportunity to discuss biorobotics for emulating and studying animal locomotion. Many sustainable development goals demand unparalleled access to the environments. Animals can go everywhere and therefore can inspire robots that assist us in biodiversity conservation, environmental monitoring, safety inspections, natural disaster search and rescue, and security. The bio-inspired robot design is challenging, but fortunately there continues to be a convergence of life and technology, bringing together enabling technologies, theory, synthesis of systems, and an increasing application demand. Nature's diversity really does enable discoveries. You saw some of the examples already, and we can use the principles and analogies from biology when advantageous, integrating with the best existing human solution to inspire robots. And as our human technologies take on more of the characteristics of nature, nature becomes a much more useful teacher. The success is remarkable. Just look at a few of these examples from the covers of the journal Science Robotics. So here we're emphasizing the productive synergy where we can use robotic physical models, ideas, approaches, and devices to test new biological hypotheses and allow novel measurements. Now, to understand our animal model, we create both mathematical and physical models, and then our new animal discoveries can lead back to new mathematical and physical models, and then those models can inform one another. Physical models are incredibly valuable because they can uncover unknown important parameters missed in mathematical models, because physical models meet the real environment. They can be a starting point when no mathematical models exist at all. Physical models can allow novel experiments not easily modeled mathematically or done on an animal. And physical models can be a first step towards prototypes for an application. We tend to think of locomotion as starting from sort of the brain and spinal cord to the musculoskeletal system that interacts with the environment, with control being realized by sort of neurofeedback, like Elke talked about, using reflexes. But it's important to remember that the brain has a body that can exert mechanical feedback, actually often before reflexes. So sometimes it's called a preflex. Intelligent mechanical control can be built into the morphology and the material properties of tissues so that it can manage energy and reject perturbation, much kind of like a tuned suspension in our vehicles. So here's how we use physical model to understand animal leg design. Cockroaches can rapidly traverse rough terrain, and we can test the hypotheses of leg function by changing the leg design and position on an amazing physical model, the hexapedal robot Rex, built by our engineering collaborators now at UPenn, and it could negotiate rough terrain in the field. The robot Rex has begun to act as a field assistant, monitoring erosion to combat climate change that can impact our coastal zones, arid regions, and agricultural fields, actually by measuring erodibility using a novel plowing test of surface soil shear resistance. We also discovered cockroaches could morph their bodies to access confined spaces, not only squeezing through the smallest cracks, but actually rapidly running when they're compressed in half. So we designed a robot called Cram using origami to better understand the animal's skeletal design and leg movement. But in the future, you could imagine it being used to enter rubble after a disaster. So here it is moving compressed in half through a confined space. We also discovered that geckos seem to be able to go anywhere with the help of feet that adhere by millions of tiny little hairs. If you look at each hair, they kind of have the worst case of split ends possible, having tips on the nanoscale interacting by intermolecular or van der Waals forces. And to move, they actually lift their toes by peeling, which is very odd looking. And our incredible engineering collaborators at Stanford built a robot called StickyBot, which helped us explain how the gecko adhesive needs to be loaded to function. And this robot could climb smooth surfaces like windows and walls and go where other robots could not. We found that geckos use their tails to rapidly right their body in midair to position themselves in a gliding posture. And we made a robot that could do the same to test how the geckos use this inertial assisted control. We discovered that inertial assisted tail control can also simplify pitch stabilization in jumping. You see this lizard. The lizards can redirect momentum from their body into their tail. And we tested tail control with a robot we named TailBot, and we even did a dinosaur simulation to see what they could do in terms of stability. The physical models we use for testing hypotheses can actually be translated into effective robots, not only for pitch control, but also turning, ground righting, and are even being used for flight. Accessing granular media in coastal areas is extremely challenging for vehicles, but our research on ghost crabs led to the design of a robot Ariel that could maneuver in the surf zone, which helped test hypotheses of leg design in the crabs and could be used for humanitarian demining. Our recent work on sand crab burrowing revealed principles that actually led to the first vertical burrowing, self-burrowing robot, which gave us new insights into the hypotheses of how the crab appendage functions during burrowing. Now, we don't have any idea how squirrels do this, how they know what their body can do, how they know the environment can handle it. And needless to say, there's no robot that comes close to this kind of agility. So certainly we must complement mechanical intelligence with neurocomputational intelligence involving the integration of perception and attention, memory, deliberation, motivation, learning, innovation. In our current project on free-ranging squirrels, we're examining these areas, decision-making, learning, and innovation, and their integration with biomechanics. And we tested decision-making on branches that varied in their stiffness and found they often stuck the landing, but frequently they actually undershot the landing or overshot the landing. Yet, amazingly, their mechanical system showed incredible fault tolerance with this fail-safe mechanical design, so they never fell in over 100 trials. And they constantly surprised us by innovating new ways to perform, like this one really surprised us. Just amazing. So to understand landing control, we took our equipment outside and measured the forces to test dynamic high-impact landing balance control hypotheses. And fortunately, we were collaborating with incredible engineers at Berkeley who made an amazing physical model named Salto, where they revealed some of the key parameters for landing control. And clearly, we could see that the squirrel uses incredible feet that has specialized pads that play a role. And so now we're testing mechanical intelligence using robotic feet. I think really a grand challenge to understanding how animals locomote will require some kind of integration of machine learning AI and physics-based multi-scale modeling. So how do we best combine the powerful correlational techniques with physics-based models that can uncover the mechanisms explaining the emergence of function that we see? So to conclude, the synergy between biology and robots holds promise for both. I think future metamaterials will take us beyond the soft regime to materials that couple sensing, actuation, computation, and communication. That embodied control displaying mechanical intelligence has the opportunity to show energy savings, computational efficiency, and also biodegradability and sustainability. The integration of AI and machine learning with multi-scale physical modeling will allow robots to access environments for good, listed here. However, we must preserve animals in their environments. Otherwise, their secrets will be lost forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, very thought-provoking. And at this point then, I guess we can open up for questions. I guess they're coming in or can come in on the AI for Good video wall. But in the meantime, as that happens, I'm going to kick off with a few questions myself for the speakers. And I'm going to get right back to the front. Andy, if you can come back into visibility. Are you there somewhere? Yeah, great. Okay. And one of the things that one of the points you were making at the end was one of communication, and communication in this, as Amy put it, the two-way street between classically trained engineers and classically trained biologists. And I was wondering if you had identified any sort of best practice ways of doing this. Was there a key to successful methods of communication, or anything that worked well for you that could be useful for other people trying this kind of research?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Okay. Best practices would be that there would be an open dialogue. I think the problem we had with Boston Dynamics, now don't get me wrong, they're a tremendous organization and company, and they've developed, anyone can go on YouTube to see the modern range of robots that they have that are very impressive, but their intellectual property is protected for their own benefit from a corporate point of view. I think where there's a collaboration with an academic colleague coming from bioengineering, as Bob has had with his collaborations, and I think Alka as well, that provides, I think, a more open dialogue of what the engineers see as the problems that they're trying to solve on the physical model of the robot, and what the biologists can sort of provide insight for. We ended up showing lots of videos of animals moving and talking about what we thought were the key elements of developing robust movement over uneven terrain, and where the energy was being generated, the actuation within the limb, and then being passively or actively controlled. But there is very little to give us a feedback on how well our analysis played out in terms of their engineering design. So I think it's really important for the engineers to be open about what are the strengths of what they're learning, what are the failures, and so that informs the biologist to think about what kind of analysis of morphology and kinematics and overall biomechanical function could be tested in the biological context.
Yeah, so there needs to be more feedback about feedback.
Exactly, feedback between going both ways. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bob.
I would say that we've had a great opportunity to do that by forming these interdisciplinary teams where we do what Andy's saying is that we meet weekly and discuss carefully whether or not the collaboration is really providing something to each discipline. And so I call this mutualistic teaming. And so the engagement rate remains really high because the collaboration solves something directly benefiting your discipline or your robot. And if you can and literally focus on, is that happening for everybody, then I think that you can get to that stage where the collaboration really just takes off so that the collective discoveries are beyond what any single discipline could do.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I wonder about the next stage of this as well. So we all work in departments, and sometimes those departments have names above the door. Mine's called the Department of Comparative Biomedical Sciences, and it's obviously quite bioscience. I know Andy works in a biological-based department as well. But of course, we have conversations and discussions every day between these silos of biology and engineering. And I don't really consider myself like firmly rooted, or perhaps rooted, but not currently floating around just the biological world. And I go to engineering conferences and I speak that language as well. So rather than interdisciplinary research, I wonder if we need to be sort of breaking down the discipline barriers and maybe looking to the next generation of scientists coming in that are already inherently interdisciplinary, and as we all are these days, are using AI and machine learning algorithms as tools to do the work at the section of science that we want to do work. If anybody has any comment on that philosophy.
I think yes. I think that in academia silos are very prominent, and I think sometimes they're not. You know, they're for some fields they're not bad. For some fields, and like not what we're talking about today, it's okay to be really focused on your discipline, and it's what's more needed is breaking down the silos is one way to go about it, but also building bridges, maybe like very clear bridges and pathways, so that we don't necessarily take down the silos, but we can. It's really easy to cross. It's easy for a student, for example, to be trained in both departments without one or the other being taking away from, without them having to pay like an extra tax for being interdisciplinary. So maybe that could be like maybe reducing the barrier of entry.
Yeah, I think that's really useful.
And I think the funding has to, the agencies that provide research funding have to recognize the value of interdisciplinary research and develop, incentivize that to develop sort of collaborative teams that are going to put in proposals. And I think DARPA and ONR in the US do a good job of that. I think the Human Frontiers of Science program also does a good job. I think ALCA's had funding through. So I think it's the more we can get funding agencies to support interdisciplinary research across what have been historically traditional boundaries is really key.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take a question that's come over from the neural network here. So Jonathan Walker asks, can you give some example of practical use cases you think will be possible in the next 5 years, please? We've seen some like brilliant proof of concept, and then some things which have really taken through to very successful field trials, particularly the Boston Dynamics style work. So what are your thoughts on what perhaps the next thing will be which comes through in the next 5 years or so? Alka, did you raise a hand there?
Yeah, I love the question. So yeah, my dream would be robots for inspection in complex to reach places, especially amphibious places. So in sewers or pipes, places, even places where divers, like in between air and water and ground, divers will not be able to go. You have a form factor that's complicated. So on our side, we would dream to see an application for inspection for our amphibious robots. And of course, search and rescue is a wonderful place as well. Unfortunately, the market of search and rescue is small, but the market for inspection is quite big. So that would be for us one possible application.
Yeah, I quite agree. All those tricky to reach places, not necessarily even on this planet, is probably where it's going to be most useful in the foreseeable future. Although it's quite interesting that the funding agencies that Andrew mentioned a moment ago, like DARPA, for example, has sort of defense background, of course, and mission. So do we think it's likely to come more in the defense realm to begin with, or are we already at the stage now where the robotics and the algorithms that we're using are accessible and shareable with civil application, perhaps as the primary outlet now? Anybody want to take that on?
I'll say
maybe we can mull that one over. Yeah.
The National Science Foundation has created a new program called the Technology Innovation Partnerships. And it does that. It requires you to have interdisciplinary teams with some kind of government organization or a company that focuses on translation. So it looks at use-inspired research and really tries to facilitate that whole process of technology innovation. Partnerships from the NSF is really, I think, putting a substantial amount of funding into that direction.
Right. So another question's come through from Dries Marzugri. With respect to validating a biological hypothesis using a bio-inspired robot, how necessary is it to also have the physical prototype apart from, say, a simulation model in a physics simulator? And then he gives the examples of Majoko or NVIDIA Isaac, and other simulators are available. Yeah, Amy, do you want to have first go at that one?
Sure. I think it depends on the problem that or the questions that you're asking. So, for example, in my case, a lot of the work we're doing involves fluids and highly nonlinear, highly separated. Sometimes the modeling is very inhibitive in terms of, let's say, hours and hours and hours of simulations, and then even then there are still areas where it's not very accessible. So sometimes it's easier to start with the physical model and then kind of have the physical model feed in the simulations and to make them faster, to make them more accurate in areas where they're blind. So I think it's not either or, it depends. Sometimes it's easier to maybe start with a very reduced order model, even analytical, not even numerical, just to make sure that you're not building anything that's crazy or that's not going to work. And then after that, I think it's just and it's a highly iterative process. It's not either or. At least that has been my experience.
Yeah, mine too. Iteration is quite important here, oftentimes. And Alka, did you want to comment on that one as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with Amy that the real world is very complex to simulate. Not only the physics, but I mean the interaction, but even the perception part is hard to do. So validating everything on the physical model is always great and good, especially in hard, this difficult to simulate environments. That being said, in many, at least in our project, we always have simulations as well. So for the paleontology robotics project, 90% of the results were from a good simulator in WebBox with a good physics engine that could then complement everything we did with the real robot. And then the real robot becomes a perfect tool to validate the simulator for some key experiments. And I think the combination of the two can be powerful. And one thing where simulators are better, I would say, is to rapidly change morphologies, body properties, muscle models. That's something much easier to do in simulation than the real hardware. So I would always favor the two together, as Amy also said. If you can do the two together, I think it's the best.
Yeah, I think as Bob mentioned, it's where the simulation meets the real world is sometimes where you get some surprises. And we know that there might be theoretical solutions which are maybe unphysical or physically impractical using the hardware that we're looking to do, and that includes the biological hardware that the animal models have as well. So that's really where you learn something about limitations, and that might be simply the range of motion of a joint, but it could be more complex than that, and it could be something to do with brain neural architecture or so on and so forth. Okay, so I heard another question from Chen Li. Hello, Chen. And that is, how do we leverage recent learning approaches? It seems that such approaches cannot easily provide mechanistic insights, often even not tractable given the complexity of deep neural networks. On the other hand, in some cases where data is plentiful and some parts of the models are well developed, adding learning approaches to stimulate the nervous or neuromechanical control systems like brains have resulted in simulation or even robots that start to move in animal-like fashions while not seeking mechanistic insights. So that's quite a long and complex question. Answer it as you see fit. Yeah, go ahead, Auke.
So, hi, Cham. We are at the same conference, so we can talk about this later, but the quick answer is the use of what we feel. There are super exciting things happening in deep learning, especially reinforced learning, super nice for locomotion. But I agree with you, sometimes you have like a black box, you don't know what you learn because you have like a black box approach. But what we found is it's still interesting as a placeholder. For instance, for locomotion, a big question we have is how high parts of the brain can interact with the spinal cord. So there we use reinforced learning to represent policies presenting supraspinal control. So as a placeholder of the brain, and then we can see, depending on what sensory information we provide or not, we can see if it's easy to or not to learn locomotion. So at least that approach where you put some knowledge domain in the circuitry of the spinal cord and use it only in part of the model, we found it quite powerful. And I have to say I'm impressed by what reinforcement learning can do these days. So it's a useful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And this also goes some way to answering John Yakatura's question as well. Hello, John. Nice to see you here. Who asks, like, where does AI come into play? Can you provide concrete examples where you think AI will improve your research and speed up gaining insights? And for me, it's a dimensional reduction type thing, in that if you can make some simple linear models up to about a handful, then you can do that quite naturally. If you've got many inputs, perhaps of different modalities, then that's where you need to let the computer do the thinking. It does lead to some black boxes, though, which you would ideally disentangle later on. But certainly that's the route that we're getting most traction in terms of our obstacle avoidance mosquito-inspired quadcopters, where we have a lot of sensors, and that's a lot of information coming at different data rates and in different formats sometimes. And that's absolutely where the algorithms that we're using are excelling. But I don't know if that's the same story for everybody on the panel.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the future where AI can really help, both in terms of learning as well as dealing with very large dimensional space of both sensory and motor outputs being very complex in a real world environment.
Right.
So computational neuroscience, I think, really comes into play there, along with people that can implement those AI models.
Absolutely, and we recognize that that neural networks are bio-inspired themselves up to a point. And after that, we're still processing them largely on the same sort of silicon chip architecture, which is not exactly the same architecture as the brain, of course. So there's a lot more that could be done in terms of bio-inspiration on the hardware and the processor side of things, let alone processing the information that comes in from a vast array of distributed sensors that you see in biology. And Amy, did you want to come in on this as well? Possibly with the last comment before I wrap up.
Oh, okay.
Not to put any pressure on, of course. It's got to be a great one.
Well, no, I just wanted to agree with you and say also, even on the input side, right? Like a lot of the problems we have are there's a huge parameter space, and navigating the design space intelligently would be very helpful. So reducing your, experimental matrix and in a way that kind of while providing insights into running, let's say, 100 experiments instead of thousands of experiments, for example.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I hope the audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. I think that's been an absolutely fascinating conversation about the current state of the art. There's another outro presentation before we'll reconvene in the networking session of the AI for Good website. But for now, I'm going to thank all the speakers, my own personal round of applause to you all, and hand over to our technical moderator to see us out. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and a big thanks to our speakers, Oak, Andrew, Amy, and Robert, as well to all the participants for making it such an interesting discussion. We had lots of great questions today and amazing insight into the emerging field of biorobotics. We encourage now to check out the AI for Good program online to see more robotic sessions that may be of interest to you. On October the 10th, we'll have a session, an AI for Good robotics webinar on computer vision for the next generation of autonomous robots. And in October the 24th, we'll have a session on rehabilitation robotics, advancing physical therapy for improved health outcomes. We are very much looking forward to engaging with you in our upcoming events. And now is the end of this section and the start of the networking in the AI for Good neural network with the panelists and participants for the next 15 minutes. See you all in a couple of minutes now, and I'm going to give the floor back to Anna for the closing information. Thank you very much.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.